Hello, hello everyone. My name is Aram Mosheedi. I'm a curator here at the Hammer. Thank you all for joining us today on the occasion of the opening of Alan Ruppersberg Intellectual Property 1968 to 2018, an impressive exhibition that everyone at the museum is so proud and excited to present in Los Angeles. I'm the organizing curator of this show for the Hammer. I was assisted by curatorial assistant Ikechukwu Onyewuni, but the real credit goes to Siri Engberg, senior curator and director of exhibitions management for the Visual Arts Department at the Walker Art Center, who meticulously researched and organized the exhibition and accompanying publication for the Walker. Having first opened at the Walker last year, the exhibition brings together over 50 years of works by this seminal artist, from early environments and location pieces to more recent installations and the debut of a new 13-hour video featured in the museum's vault gallery. So please make sure not to miss that. And also just to say that the galleries will still be open until 5 o'clock after the talk today, so you're more than welcome to spend some more time. Hailing originally from Cleveland, Ohio, and moving to Los Angeles in 1962 to study commercial illustration at Chouinard Art Institute, Ruppersberg is widely regarded as one of the key figures in the first generation of conceptual artists. In many ways, one can see from the exhibition upstairs that from its earliest moments, Ruppersberg's work has touched upon almost every aspect of art making and almost every major movement or tendency within the history of recent art. Evocations of the ready-made, surrealism, assemblage, happenings, conceptualism, process art, minimalism, land art, performance, installation, as well as more traditional approaches like painting, sculpture, collage, and drawing are present throughout this impressive body of work. Ruppersberg's influence on subsequent generations of artists is unparalleled by many of the other names who are often associated with the period of the 1960s and 1970s. Throughout the decades that followed his emergence as an artist, Ruppersberg has remained consistently fresh and innovative, all the while staying true to the themes and tendencies that appeared in his work as early as his first solo exhibition at Eugenia Butler Gallery in Los Angeles in 1969. The impact of his work on the artists who have since been identified with appropriation, relational aesthetics, and the more recent phenomenon of social practice is notable to say the least. But beyond this art historical laundry list, Ruppersberg's work can be characterized by its accessibility, by its engagement with familiar sources, materials, references, and contexts that are particularly known to many of us in Los Angeles. His work touches upon the histories of film, music, and literature, but it also frames our experience of the history of American vernacular culture, the lost or so-called lesser art forms, and the stuff that would otherwise, in his words, be destined to disappear. It's a great honor to have an exhibition of this scale and magnitude to share with you all, and I hope you will take the time for many repeat visits before it closes in May. On April 30th, art historians Thomas Crow and Alexander Dumbadze will join us for a conversation on the artistic milieu of the 1960s and 1970s and how it shaped Ruppersberg and his contemporaries. We will have additional walkthroughs of the exhibition by artists Mungo Thompson, Catherine Andrews, Raul Guerrero, Fiona Connor, and writer Jan Tumler throughout, so please check the Hammer calendar for more details. Ruppersberg broke onto the international scene when he was included in the now legendary exhibition Live in Your Head, When Attitudes Become Form, at the Kunsthalle Bern in 1969. He has exhibited in the US and Europe ever since, but has not had a major retrospective in the United States since 1985. Recent solo exhibitions have taken place at Marc Selwyn Gallery and the Skirball Cultural Center in Los Angeles, Air de Paris in Paris, Green Neftali in New York, Wiel's Contemporary Art Center in Brussels, and the Art Institute of Chicago. His work is in the collections of the Berkeley Art Museum, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Milwaukee Art Museum, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, and the MCA Chicago, as well as the Museum for Modern Kunst in Frankfurt, and here in Los Angeles, the Hammer, MoCA, and LACMA. So just to paraphrase that, I think of Alan Ruppersberg as something of a legend. Al will be joined in conversation today by the Walker's Siri Engberg, who has worked as part of the museum's curatorial team since 1990. Siri has served as lead curator or coordinator for over 50 exhibitions, among them solo shows of artists that include Klaus Oldenburg, Ellsworth Kelly, Ed Ruscha, Saul LeWitt, Joan Mitchell, Lorna Simpson, and Christian Marclay. Her past projects include Lifelike, a group exhibition examining notions of hyperreality in contemporary art, and the survey exhibitions From Here to There, Alex Soth's America, Chuck Close Self-Portraits 1967 to 2005, and Kiki Smith, A Gathering, all of which toured throughout the country. Most recently, of course, Engberg curated the major retrospective Alan Ruppersberg Intellectual Property 1968 to 2018 for the Walker Art Center, the artist's first comprehensive survey, as I said before, in over 30 years. She has authored or contributed to numerous exhibition catalogs, authored catalog raisonnés on the prints and books of Edward Ruscha and the prints of Robert Motherwell, and she was a member of the core planning team which completed a major renovation of the Walker's outdoor campus and the Minneapolis Sculpture Garden in 2017. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank those who made gifts to help both make the Walker and Hammer realize this important project. The Henry Luce Foundation, the Prospect Creek Foundation, and the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts lent great support, as well as Carlo Bronzini Vendor, Jill and Peter Krause, Margot Levin, Maya Ori, Kathy and Gary Cypress, Karen Cole and Silas Dilworth, Chara Schreier and Gordon Freund, and Lenny and Bernie Greenberg. We are also grateful to Carol Green and her staff at Green Neftali in New York, and Mark Selwyn and his staff at the gallery here in Los Angeles. So with that, please join me in welcoming Alan Ruppersberg and Siri Engberg to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Aram, and thanks to all of you for being here today. We want to thank the Hammer for hosting us and for hosting this exhibition. It's wonderful to have it here in LA, and hope you all enjoy it. So I want to talk a bit, since I'm from Minneapolis and you're from Cleveland, I thought maybe we'd start the talk with the Midwest and think about that a bit. And I'm just going to start here. You, as a young man, were very interested in animation and in cartooning and thinking and drawing. You had an aptitude for drawing. And I guess I want to talk a bit about what it was about Los Angeles that lured you out here, because I know you started thinking about it when you were about 11.
That's right. That's right. Is that on? Yeah, okay.
It's on.
Okay, well, I might repeat some stories that other people have heard along the way, but my parents brought me out here when I was 11 to go to Disneyland because I wanted to be an animator. And Disneyland had just opened, and they had something called the Art Corner, which you see there in the picture. And so that was the defining moment, was to come out to LA and not just go to Disneyland, but to see California as a kid from the Midwest who, saw all kinds of better things than there were in Cleveland. And so at that point I was about 11, and I had made up my mind to myself. And so when it came time, when the parents asked the kids, okay, well, what do you think you're going to do? Where are you going to go to school? And they sit you down, and I said, well, I'm going to California. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, I think we knew that.
And that was that.
And that was that. And then I got accepted at Chouinard and got on the bus and arrived.
And I should mention this ephemera we're showing, the letter of your acceptance, the souvenirs from Disneyland you've saved. And ephemera is something that is going to become an important part of our conversation, I think, in the next few minutes. But talk a bit about Chouinard. What was that experience like for you? Who were you studying with? Who were you meeting? What were you making?
Well, it's divided into two parts. because the first couple of years you're required to, take introductory classes that cover everything. And so, when I arrived, and it was really kind of great because the school didn't have any place for you to go. I got off the bus and took my suitcase, and I remember I walked into Chenard and I said, well, what do I do?
Oh, they had no dorms.
They had no dorms.
Oh.
They had nothing. And they said, well, there's a boarding house down the street. You can go down there. And so then I lugged the suitcases down to the boarding house. And that was really great because, you could start over with everything. And so then, the first class was a drawing class, and then the next class was a whatever. And then after I took the first painting class, it was like, that's the eureka moment. I'm there. It was a plein air painting class with one of the, kind of basic teachers. And I said, okay, that's it. No more commercial art.
No more of that.
No more commercial art. No more advertising. And the thing was that Chenard had very good reputation in New York for people coming out of Chenard to go into advertising because it was very experimental at the time. And so it was like giving up a job that you knew that you were going to have when you got out of school. And you just go, well, I'm sorry, this is what I'm going to do.
So, you studied with Robert Irwin, and there were quite a few artists in that orbit when you were there that I know started influencing the way you were thinking about how you could even move beyond painting into something else.
Yeah, I mean, the main painting teacher was Emerson Wolfer. When he was the one that you knew was like, the really serious good artist, and that was the first introduction to serious painting was with Emerson. And then Bob Irwin taught night school, and so I decided to.
Oh, we've lost our PowerPoint. It's okay.
I decided to. That was after when I decided that I was going to be an artist and not a commercial or ad man, and I began to. No, we got the wrong pictures here. Sorry.
Where's Al?
We don't want that picture up there. No. Okay.
Okay.
So anyway, after I, began to investigate what Chenard was like as a fine arts school, and began to meet the other students then who were painters and sculptors, because that's the only thing that really existed then. And then I discovered Bob Irwin teaching at night, and learned a tremendous amount from him, not only just his practice, but him as a person, who then, we didn't spend a lot of time at school. We had our own studios that we got somewhere out. And Bob would come over and, sit there and talk, and that's the best education you can get.
Yeah. And so I think one of the things that you've talked about before, and that I think is really instrumental to some of these first works that you began to make as you entered LA. Oh, here's another one. Was that you landed in LA at this kind of perfect storm of conceptual art emerging. The pop art was already flourishing, minimalism was happening, the counterculture was happening, and you were a young artist hitting this in this kind of amazing stride as all of this was happening at the same time. And what was that like to be part of that energy?
Well, I look back now and I think, wow, you were at the right age, at the right time, in the right place, and it is all of those things you mentioned, and the counterculture and the whole, LA was ground zero.
Yeah.
For that. LA and San Francisco were ground zero for that. So to be here at that time, I can't underestimate the influence of what was going on in the world. I mean, we had all the Vietnam marches and the protests and the love-ins and everything else all feeds into the work. And then, like you say, I just went to the Warhol. I saw the Warhol show at the Whitney, and it's a perfectly fine show. But I had seen every single piece in there in its time, including the early movies, which you could see here when they were made. They used to have midnight movies over on Western.
Right.
And so, very early on, you saw everything going on if you made the effort. And then you had shows by Kienholz and the Assemblage people here and Wallace Berman and et cetera. And so it's all in one big swirl. And it was great.
So this is one of your first studio spaces. We have a couple studio pictures along the way here. And maybe you can talk a bit about how creating some of these studio environments early on and filling them with things, as you have done here, and maybe even in this one, began to feed the work that would come in those first few years. Now you're out of school, it looks like, in this picture.
What was the question exactly?
Well, I guess I'm curious about how you began to collect and use source material, because I can see you've already started by this point.
No, it's true. I mean, but at the same time, I don't know how conscious it is. I mean, I saved stuff when I was a kid too, and so. As you're thinking about what you want to make, you begin to, gather the stuff around you that, you want to find out how to use it. And so even though I collected all of that stuff, some of it maybe didn't get used for 20 years. Right. And people always talk about being a collector. Well, it really isn't like that. It's stuff that you want to make art out of,
right.
and you can't disassociate the collecting from the period either. That when you're saying okay, and my generation had the art world out there to say no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to paint anymore. I'm not going to make a sculpture anymore. We're going to, do something. So you can't take that away from the other cultural, things going on. So then, if you're not going to make paintings and you're not going to make sculptures, what are you going to do? And that's the beginning of the conceptual
right.
Approach that is still, firmly in what I do.
And you kind of set your working methods pretty early on. I mean, it seems like you've worked in a very similar way from the beginning, as you say, in terms of deciding what you would make, figuring out the form it would take, and then executing that piece. And that seems to be the general way that many of these have come together. The earliest ones you've talked about were about using very common materials, and that is something that still happens today. Cardboard boxes, grocery store items, pieces of glass, found furniture from flea markets. You used what was at hand, and you still do in many ways.
Now it becomes firmly ensconced in just any approach, but the approach that is evident there, and the approach that is, even in the newest work, is that things come to you. You have a certain way of doing things. People asked me one time, well, how do you know what you're going to do, And I said, well, you follow your nose. And so you have interest in this or this or this, and if you're Don Judd, then you have an interest in industrial production and so on, seriality, etc. And so you can see some of those influences. You can see certainly pop art. You can see, and so then it just comes to you. But what you said is still the operating. It's the operating system.
Yes.
That is, the idea dictates how it's made. And so that's why each work maybe looks different, but it's also the kind of artist I happen to be.
And in your early years of LA, really spent a lot of time exploring the city. Coming out here was something new, but really understanding LA as a place was also something that you were very concerned about doing and interested in doing. So the early works have a lot to do with the idea of the place of LA. And you called some of these early works location pieces. This idea of finding items from a certain place and reframing them in a way, either for the camera, as you've done here, or in some of these early assemblage works that bring bits of that landscape back into the studio. Can you talk a little bit about how your forays into the landscape or your explorations around the city and how those fed the work early on? This is a work called The Campfire, by the way, from the late 1960s, 69, I believe.
Well, it comes from the what ultimately was, taught as post-studio art. I mean, if you're not going to be in the studio making paintings or sculpture, then you're going to be bringing something into the gallery. You're going to be bringing some kind of information or ideas into the gallery, and so again, it's hard to separate the fact that you want to explore LA because at that time it was easy to do, and so that gets mixed up with what you're fascinated with, not only the city but the art that's being made and the kind of art you want to make. So, and the kind of art that you're influenced by, and of course, the most indigenous art form in LA is probably assemblage. And so, of course, I knew those people and was influenced by some of them. And so you see the assemblage, and so where are you going to get the stuff? I'm out exploring LA from as they used to say, the mountains to the sea. And so bringing it in, and then you see it laying around the studio, and eventually you say, oh, well, okay, what's a sculpture? And you might have the influence of Larry Bell, which you can see in these, but these were ready-mades, you just went down to the, store and bought these, but they looked like minimalist objects. And so then, the outside went into the inside.
The outside. And this notion of having a container to fill is something that's kind of been part of a number of your works, even up to the Colby posters that we will look at in a minute. But what I think what's interesting about what you said earlier is that you had this generation of artists just a bit older than you, the minimalists, some of the pop artists who were already well established, and you were, in some of these early works, referencing them in a way that was very conscious, but also creating something entirely new from them. These boxes, these aquariums, you've called them, what did you say, a well-lighted world. You could turn the light on and have this kind of stage for the objects. And each one of them is a sort of a mini narrative, like a Joseph Cornell box almost, but like you say, they have this affinity to Larry Bell or to Donald Judd. The aquariums became location pieces. You called each one a location piece. The one on the left has a canvas in it, a blank canvas, and that was your very first one. And then these became props in a way for some of the later works. But I guess this idea of location piece is something I'd love you to go into just a bit more. This was your first major, large-scale location piece, and this was the invitation for your...
That was my studios up there.
So the very first exhibition you were offered in a gallery was at Eugenia Butler. And it was her first show as a gallerist as well. So this was kind of a major moment for both of you.
As far as I remember, anyway.
Yeah, I think it was.
Exactly 50 years ago, so...
Almost to the date, the March, exactly. And when one walked into Eugenia Butler to see your debut show, they saw very few objects. They saw just a few things scattered in the room, but they were given an address, which was what we're looking at over here on the right, your studio space above the stereo supply store. And can you explain what happened next? What was the process by which they actually saw your show?
Well, first they went to the address as you see, on La Cienega, where everybody knew the gallery was. And then, like you say, there was a couple of, minor things laying around. And then there was an address to my studio on Sunset here. That's Sunset and Gardner. And I had a series of office rooms that I used for studios and everything else. And I just took one of them. I took one of them and made the work inside of the room, which is this. And so when people got the address to leave the gallery because it really wasn't a show there, then they had to come over here, and the piece itself is about the same size as the room that it was built in. So you could, the viewer could only go in through the front here. I had enough room behind it to walk around, but that was about it. Mm-hmm. So when you walked into the room, that's what you saw, and that was the exhibition.
And this object, or this installation, or this construction, whatever you'd like to think of it as, is made entirely of canvas. It's in the exhibition upstairs. So it's kind of a room made of paintings in a way. It's filled with sculpture. It's filled with found objects. It has a pane of glass at the back. So it was this kind of curious object, but you constructed it as all three of those things, as an installation, a painting, and a sculpture. What was that? What were people's reactions when they walked into the studio?
I have no idea.
Were they confused?
I don't have a clue anymore, except I just know that I was the gallery sitter.
Yes.
I had a little chair outside the door, and I sat there, when it was supposed to be open. But what their reactions were, I have no idea. I have a few more memories of reactions to the cafe, which came after this. But
this is the cafe.
The whole history of those plywood boxes covered with canvas that make up that location piece. Obviously, when I came out of school, not obviously, but I came out of school being a painter, and I painted for, I don't know, 6 months or a year or something until, and I've told this story before, until I was doing multiple paneled paintings, on big raw unprimed canvas, kind of, cross between Morris Lewis and I don't know who else. And then Frank Stella had his Protactor show at the New Pasadena Museum. And so when I went to see that show, and again, this is a story that some people might know, but I saw that show and I went, I can't be doing this. He knows what he's doing and I don't. And this is his world, not mine. Right. And so then you start over. And that's then the photography, okay, I like to take pictures. Mm-hmm. And I collect postcards and it's imagery. Yep. And then how do you translate that? So you can see if I was going to talk only about that, you would see the transition from the raw canvas to the canvas-covered boxes to the early photo books to the location piece to the cafe and the aquariums. There is a line there that is, it's a whole nother discussion.
But many of these objects are in the show. There is a bit of a way to trace that path, I think.
It's there,
upstairs.
yeah, exactly.
But I like what you just said about being the gallery attendant at the exhibition for location piece, because that idea of becoming kind of a proprietor then led to the cafe in a way. You created this installation on a much more ambitious scale than location piece at this storefront on 6th Street in downtown LA. Al's Cafe is now kind of a art world legend, at least in Los Angeles, in terms of being a space for artists and for gathering. And it was an installation. It was a fully conceived environment that you populated with objects and invited people to inhabit. and this is we actually found these color photographs in making the exhibition. These were some of the only color ones available that were out there. But this gives you a sense of the space. And can you talk a bit about how you conceived of this cafe as a container, again, to fill with objects and people?
I don't know. I'll back up a minute and say that, when I look at the show upstairs, it was one thing to do it at the Walker, but now it's a very different thing to do it in LA.
Yes.
And so seeing all of that stuff upstairs, and looking at it and saying, well, I mean, who made that? Where did all of that come from? Who made all of those things, and why? So, it's really hard to go back and reconstruct why you did these things. But the history is there because you're creating a different art form, and you're kind of making the viewer do something that they're not used to doing, which is going to a museum and standing in front of something.
Right.
And they have to go there. They have to, participate. And so I remember on the opening night. Obviously you can trace it back to the assemblage.
Yes.
Influence. The dinners. Which had the same price as Denny's down the street, and although I don't think Denny's was around then, but as any kind of normal cafe, it was like, what were my favorite places to go to? Hotels, cafes, in those days, the kind of great old local cafes, and so I don't know, just you use what you're fascinated with. And I think most artists are incredibly intuitive, whether they admit it or not. And also, of course, you have a sense of humor involved in this that is also another element that comes from, influence of certain artists or whatever. And but when the first night that it was open, it was only open one night a week for practical reasons. And it was mostly known in art circles.
Right.
Even though eventually it became too well known. But even my artist friends who came the first night, they said, "Well, what are we supposed to do?" And then I would make one of the dinners because I made them all right there, and then bring it out, and eventually people got the idea that, oh, well, yeah, I can order. I had waitresses. I could order off the menu, and I would make them. And the other aspect of it is that it was a place to hang out for artists, which is much different than what I found in New York, where there were artist bars and artists congregated and hung out, and that wasn't here then. So this was, that's a kind of subcontent of it. Then artists then had a place to come and be artists.
Right. So the space of Al's Cafe was ephemeral. It went away, actually prematurely, because I think there was a liquor license problem. Yes, but it was. But this then led to this idea that you could continue to create these spaces, and this was your next one on Sunset, and this would then become Als Grand Hotel, which is also part of the exhibition upstairs. I know that you had been interested in, like you say, motels as a form, or cafes, kind of these archetypal American spaces. But this particular type of hotel, like say the Madonna Inn in San Luis Obispo, where every room is a theme, every single room is like an installation that's a ready-made right there for you. That I know was part of the influence of this. But as you created this, I know it took about a year to make Als Grand Hotel. How did you start thinking about the way you would conceive of those rooms?
Well, I suppose they're a combination of the dinners at the cafe and the location piece, and then just expanding them into having all these different experiences in the different rooms. Not that there was necessarily I guess you could say there was themes, but it was, again, using everything that was around. And one of my favorite movies was The Grand Hotel, so I really kind of wanted to recreate my own version of that film, and so I don't know. I don't know how I thought up each room.
The Jesus room is on the lower left, the Al room on the upper right, and so on. Each of these rooms had its own particular flavor. But what you see upstairs are pictures from the hotel, because I know you've talked about not wanting or to recreate these spaces as exactly they were in an exhibition context. So lots of times, museums have given little bits of this and little bits of that as they kind of showed it in exhibitions. But I think upstairs you really do get a sense of, especially what it was like in the hotel. I mean, again, like the cafe, this was a space for people. This was a space for gathering. It was a space where interaction happened. Terry Allen played in the lobby on opening night. And it just really looks like it became one of those amazing moments for artists to be together in Los Angeles.
Well,
This
it
is
was also,
1971, by the way.
it was something that you could do then. I mean, I wanted to have it in Hollywood. I was living up the street on Sunset there at where you saw, and I wanted it to really, have a Hollywood address, a Hollywood, because of the film and because of the industry that is here, and so I could find a big old house on Sunset right there, Sunset and Formosa, and it was affordable to rent the whole thing. So I don't know how you would do these things anymore. And so you rented it, and I really rehabbed the whole thing myself, more or less.
One of the things I love about the lobby of the hotel is you had a quote of Alan Capro on the wall. And can you speak just a moment about that idea of Capro and how he influenced some of these early pieces?
Well, I think just his whole approach to making art at that time, which in the kind of his essays about the post-Pollock world and what kind of art was making and the art of life, and so that's the theme that runs through certainly really strongly in all the early works. Yeah. And it's you throw Rauschenberg in there too with his working in the space between art and life, and Alan Capro with his performances and his early happenings, and I mean I can't underestimate the influence of all of that. Yeah. So if you kind of look at what else was just before me. And as an artist of this generation, you had something to react against, which was, no, I'm not going to be an abstract painter.
Right.
That's done with. We're through with that. And that's very different now because anything is doable, art-wise.
Absolutely. I mean, I think as you segued then into some of these later works, you the proprietor of the cafe, of the hotel, you then became a bit of a character in your own story. And many of these works made in the 70s, and I'll go through these a little more quickly, you were the protagonist in a lot of these works. This is a lecture on Houdini for Terry Allen, where you're in a straitjacket performing a lecture as you try to escape. You are here in these early photographs making the Chinese theater disappear. Here you are taking a book out of the library on Houdini and never returning it, thereby making it disappear. And here's Where's Al, which is a piece that is now one of your best-known photo works, where and it's hard to read from where all of you are because this is on index cards, but it's kind of typed in the manner of maybe a Hollywood screenplay.
Sure.
He asks a question, she answers it, and vice versa. And what we find through this kind of meandering narrative is that no one knows where Al is. Al is at Denny's. Al is at the library. Al's gone on vacation. Maybe he's in New York. And this notion of being present but also absent in your work is something that appeared in a lot of these early photo works. And you were very present at the hotel and very present at the cafe, but then suddenly you kind of disappeared.
That's true. Well, first of all, you, like myself and other artists at the time, using yourself was just the easiest thing to do because it didn't cost anything, and you could invent character. In my case, invent characters and begin to invent kind of narrative scenarios. So I think that's one thing we haven't really talked about is the use of words and the use of language and this development of narrative events. I mean, obviously the cafe and the hotel are narrative events in a way too. They're open one day a week and this happens, and then next week another thing happens, like the Grand Hotel movie. And so then this is one of the more expansive narrative things where I'm there, but nobody sees me.
No one sees you. And you can rearrange the story any way you like,
Right.
and you're still not there. Right.
I mean, the other earlier photo pieces where you could actually see me, then I began to think, I don't want to be in the pictures anymore. I don't want people to focus on me. I want to disappear.
Yeah. And just to go into this narrative aspect, the work made starting in the early 70s really had quite a lot to do with reading and a lot to do with narrative. And whereas other artists of your generation who were making conceptual work were looking at documenting actions, exploring the landscape, exploring the body, and doing it often in a very serious way, especially the East Coast conceptual photographers. Your version was a bit more narrative, if you want to use that word. It had more the feel of sometimes a storyboard or a sequence of frames in a film or something like that. This one is called Reading. I'm trying to remember the title of this one.
This is
Book Review.
Book Review,
Yes.
that's right.
So each of the books that you're holding is a different one, and you're giving each one contemplation, and then the glass breaks at the end. What's that about?
It's a review.
It just happened.
I mean, the last one really just went over the top, and that's like the best.
The best one.
The best one.
It's like the note that breaks the wine glass.
Yes, exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
But this notion of reading then started to really expand into what I think is an amazing piece. This is the picture of Dorian Gray, which you showed in 1974 at Claire Copley Gallery on La Cienega. And in this project, and I'm showing the vintage picture, we have some better ones in a minute, but this is just an incredible project. You hand copied the entire text of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray using markers and
Let's see what?
using markers and raw canvas.
Well, the early version of a Pentel.
But you copied it, and there's something about that transcribing that has stuck with you ever since, where you have copied things, reframed them, represented them in other ways as a way to give it new meaning. And I think the picture of Dorian Gray is just a really tour de force example of that. I mean, if you could talk a minute just about the process and the thought behind it and what you maybe discovered as you were making it, about how that might take you forward.
Well, if you back up a little bit and you think the beginning of narrative and using language, then you start to go into the world of being a writer, and since there was a lot of language being used in conceptual work at the time, I thought, well, if you're going to use words, you better learn how to use them, and that they're not just, as we say now about that man in the White House, that's just word salad. And so, I took an interest in learning how to write, even though I quickly learned I'm not a writer, I'm a visual artist. And so then, this was another book that came into my hands through a film, this great movie, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and then I started to read it, and you have to know the story about how it's a painting of a picture and all of that, but at the same time, I also became aware of that maybe the best way to learn how to write is to copy something, which I don't know where I got that idea, but it's kind of common. And so, it was a process where I would learn how to write by copying something that is so perfect for copying because of its epigrammatic style and then the subject matter, of course. And so it just kind of evolved into, not just reproducing something, but, making something for myself and making something that I had never seen anywhere else.
Or as
in
you
the art
said,
world.
it was a painting about a painting about
It's a book about a painting.
a painting.
You know.
But I like you've also mentioned that it's something that for the viewer you can look at or you can read, depending on
That's right.
what you choose to do. It serves both functions.
You could read the entire book in the gallery if you chose to stay there for who knows how long.
And here it's now in the collection of MoMA in New York. Here it is there just a while ago. But it's quite an experience to be standing within it. This immersion factor, I think, is something that starts to come into the work as we move forward. But then this idea of copying, using techniques of illustration to create, think about books as objects. Feels like it was kind of a growth out of that idea of
that's
copying.
True, yeah.
Going back to some of those Chenard techniques, maybe, of illustrators.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, I was taught how to, do illustration. And one of the things that I learned at the time, which illustrators did, but to my knowledge, it wasn't really being used by artists, was a projector. The illustrators, were beginning to use projectors to, get their images done rather than the old school of the models and all of that. And so, I began to use the techniques of drawing and illustration by using, books, but they were looked at as objects. The inside of Dorian Gray is available. These ones were not.
Right.
These are the covers, and that's when I started to use the projector, which now you can say, because I have a wonderful, Canon copier, it's kind of the same. It's just finding another technology.
Another technology.
I mean, Terry Allen used to call me a cheater artist because I used the projector, and he didn't. He drew.
And this is a very large-scale copied newspaper clipping in the show. So I want to move into kind of a moment mid-career for you in the mid-'80s, 1985. You had your first survey at MoCA here in Los Angeles. And this was a moment where they brought together many of the works that had been made up to this point, a lot of what we've just looked at. And you weren't very old to be having a retrospective. You were
We called it a mid-career.
A mid-career survey, but it made you kind of. I think that was a moment where to be rethought in terms of what would happen next. At this point, you had already been traveling between New York and Los Angeles since the early '70s, and it perhaps prompted this idea of maybe going bi-coastal a little more seriously. So do you want to talk a bit about the move to New York after this retrospective?
Well, because it did sum up everything that I had, done in LA from the day I first got here, through school and all of the early work and everything, that once that was presented there, and I felt, okay, well, this kind of sums up a whole lot of stuff. And, I had already had a couple different studios in New York, and so I thought, okay, well, it's just time. I found out the difference by being, bi-coastal in a more casual way in the 70s, that there's difference between being in New York all the time and being in New York part of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so then after the survey, I thought, okay, now I really need to be there all the time, even though I had spent maybe a year at a time here and a year, 6 months there, and so then it was time to just be there all the time.
And you've mentioned to me that a lot of the artists that you were meeting who were emerging in New York in the early '80s, early to mid '80s, were actually from Los Angeles, or they had been students of John Baldessari's, or they had they were really out there in New York because it was a different kind of way to have your career, and. Can you talk a bit about?
John told him to.
John told him to go east. Yeah. So what was that? What was that environment like to be with that? That was a younger generation of artists from you, but they were using appropriation. They were using image culture in a different way, and you, in a way, had already started that. But you were shown with a lot of those artists. It was kind of a new moment of becoming an emerging artist for you.
Well, yeah, it was really, because the MoCA show traveled to the new museum, and I discovered that the people later on, I discovered that, the biggest influence of that show went on to other younger artists. And so, I was kind of introduced to that generation, even though out here we all kind of knew each other because Chenard turned into CalArts, and the first generation of artists from CalArts, in those days, if you really wanted to have a serious career, you had to, be in New York. And that's what John told them, and that generation migrated to New York. So we already had a connection anyway. And then, when I began to show in the East Village with that younger generation, it all kind of conceptually made sense. And because they had seen the MoCA show at the new museum, and that's when the East Village was just starting, and Metro Pictures had just opened, and so there was a crossover between some of us here in LA who then either showed at Metro Pictures or in the other younger galleries, and that kind of solidified the generational movement, of what we kind of were doing out here, which was very different from the version of conceptual art that they were finding in New York.
Right.
And so that's a whole nother discussion. But
yeah,
I was very comfortable, of course.
And as you established your practice there more full time, you did continue a lot of those things you had started in LA in terms of accumulating source material. And I'm showing an image here from a series called Cover Art, which is in the Hammer collection, where you found a warehouse of calendars?
There was an old it was an upstairs. I don't know how I found it, but it's just partly wandering around New York, which was just fantastic to walk around. It's in the golden era of New York also, and just wandering around, and somehow I saw that there was a warehouse or an old calendar distribution center or something, and I found my way in there, and they said, yeah, just take it.
Just take it all.
Get it out of here. We don't want it, so take it. And so, I just carried as many boxes as I possibly could of all these images, which kind of define not only the Midwest, but America at the time. It's a real representation of America, because everybody then had the calendars on the wall with these pictures, including my father. And so I don't know, it's something else that just came into my hands, and then you begin to investigate the pictures and see what they say.
Right.
And then I made them into book covers, again, it's the cover. The inside is there. It's in the pictures, but I'm not writing it out.
Right. Here's another great image from that series. So this is a picture from, or several pictures from your New York studio that was in the Cable Building in Soho. And one thing I was particularly interested in showing everyone were, well, first the albums and the books and all of the things that were source material for a lot of those works, but especially this pile of films. These were the instructional films that you found them in a library, right? And they were all manner of boring, ordinary authorless films, industry films, films shown in high schools, films that you would check out if you wanted to learn how to assemble an engine.
We had to watch them in high school.
Right. But these, again, like the calendars, you acquired sort of en masse, and they began to feed works. And this is one that is in the exhibition called Remainders that has a lot to do with the film.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing here is now because you can't pick the books up anymore and leaf through them. It comes from a table of remainders, like in the Strand, you see a table of remainders, and inside, which you can't see anymore, are images from those films. And they're set up in different kind of editing sequences. So if you pick up the books and flip through it like a flip book, it's a film.
Right.
And so it's a sculpture, it's a film, it's a book, it's an object, etc. And one of the things that people don't realize is that, I designed all the covers. That's not found material.
Right.
And I tried to do, if you were able to look at the table of contents, you would see that each one is a title of a film from a different era of the country. So it's like, it's a film history also. And then you get into the titles, and then I designed the covers so that it fit the era of whatever film was in the book. And
there's a narrative that runs through all the dust jackets as well. Yeah, there are many, many layers. I mean, this is one of those pieces that has so many layers of meaning, different ways you can go into it. You can appreciate it on lots of levels, but it's probably one of the more complex works you've made, I would say, in terms of all the different ways to experience it.
To read it, yeah. No, there's infinite ways to read it.
And this was a moment where, as you were making some of these discrete objects and other more sculptural or 2D work, you were also being invited quite a lot to go to Europe. And a lot of the pieces that you were making in shows over there were these installation-oriented pieces, or pieces that were responding to place, again, like some of the early work was. And we don't have time today to go into all of those, but there were projects in Munster, there was a project in Geneva, and there was this wonderful project at the Reina Sofia in Madrid, which is in the exhibition upstairs, which has never been in the U.S., but has been recreated for this show. And it's called Lectures and Film Screenings, and this is what it looked like in Spain. Here's what it looked like a little more up close, where your collection of films seems to have fed this very strongly. And here's what it looked like at the Walker, and you'll see it upstairs too. But can you speak a bit about how this all came together as a project in terms of really responding to a place and integrating your own collections with another location?
When you are first invited to come and be in a show like this, where a lot of it is site specific, you go there and you kind of like look around and think, well, what can I do here? I'm not importing something. I'm making something up from scratch here. But at the same time, it was right after I had gotten that film collection and was starting to use them. And where the idea of the corridor came from, I think, comes from the location in the museum, which was kind of, well, maybe nobody would ever go there, but maybe I could make something in that space. So I don't know, the space kind of dictates, and then, you're using your normal, kind of materials and ideas. And so somehow they all come together there. And again, it's not that much different than the location piece.
It's art where you're not expecting to find art.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so years later, then I can make the connection between works like this and Al's Cafe or something. You know, that it becomes a way of working. And so one of the things that you see here, you know, at a certain time when AV rooms existed, audiovisual rooms, they had a certain look.
Yes.
and what was in there. And so one of the things you see on the table there is a 16 millimeter projector taken apart down to the smallest screw. And I had a number of projectors, and I gave one to the last remaining projector repairman in New York City. And I gave him a projector. I said, just take it apart as far as you can possibly take it. And it took him quite a while, but that's the result there. So it's this disassembled projector. It's the images from the films that would go through the projector, and then the rooms where you hear the lecture are, you know, what would be in these films in a way. I mean, one would be history, one would be philosophy. You know, they covered the waterfront of subject matter in the world of these educational industrial films, from the beginning of sound up to the introduction of VHS video.
What I love about the environment you've created as well is that, you know, like the cafe or the hotel, it feels like it's, I think maybe what you've said is an indeterminate past. It could be a school anywhere. It could be a hallway anywhere. It's familiar. It's not familiar. And there's this kind of timelessness about it as a space too. And I think some of those archetypal spaces have been ones that you've returned to again. The bookstore with remainders. So as an environment, people really kind of have that moment of where am I or I've been here.
Particularly in a museum. That
Exactly.
was the idea.
Right. So it takes you back. So I'm moving to sort of the last section of the exhibition too. I want to talk about this idea of homage and memorials a bit, which is a strain that goes through your work. In many works, you know, like Dorian Gray, for example, you paid homage to a writer, some of the book drawings. This is a series of works where you're working, again, like Dorian Gray, with a text. In this case, it's the obituary of Robert Rauschenberg from the New York Times. Can you speak a bit about some of these homages or these memorials, and also the importance of the newspaper to you?
Well, I don't know. The newspaper is you know, something that I learned to like when I was a kid, and so that's this kind of a you know, world that I don't know. That's just been there for a long time. Yeah. But the Rauschenberg, particularly, because there's different kinds of memorials, and so the memorials that I made in Europe were about Europe, particularly World War II, and because, you know, the cities in Europe that, you know, where these exhibitions were held have a very important role in World War II in America and all of that, and so those memorials are mostly about that. Again, going to the city and saying, okay, what's this really about, and what's here, and what can I find?
What's the context?
But this is obviously a memorial to somebody who I knew and was very influential on me, and then when he died and the obit came out, I mean, it was like almost book length. It was the longest.
Michael Kimmelman wrote it.
Michael Kimmelman wrote it for the New York Times, and it was just the longest, you know, obituary and of probably one of the most influential artists. So I had done some obits before that I'd copied when AIDS first began. I began to notice that there was obituaries of people that you really were not famous people, but they began to, you know, document this onslaught of AIDS. And so I had started to use obituaries, and then I started collecting obituaries of artists, writers, musicians, poets, all of that.
The clippings collection.
Yes,
Yeah.
and so I had to find different ways to use them, and this is made by by copying the letters from an old anagram game. You know, put them on the color copier and make infinite copies of all the letters, and then put them together and recreate the obituary.
And again, the materials are very simple. It's pegboard. It's color copies. But you can read it from beginning to end.
You can read it from beginning to end, absolutely. And it's visual.
It's very visual, as is this one. This is another kind of homage or memorial. I mean, these are hand-painted signs commissioned from sign painters around. It was just L.A., right? These were all
just L.A.
Yeah. Again, kind of a dying art.
That's right.
And the titles in these are from your collection of pulp novels. Is that right?
It's a collection of pulp magazines, pulp. What now everybody knows as pulp fiction.
And so, in a way, what we see here is kind of a double narrative, a couple of layers. But there's that dying art of the paperback or the pulp novel. But then, each of the titles from your collection has been very meticulously lettered by these artisans, really, who are artists in themselves in terms of the way they use typography, the way that they populate the LA landscape with their paintings.
Well, I just
like
gave them the
paintings,
text.
really.
I wrote the text, and it's a kind of rubric of how to organize all these themes that are in the titles of the pulp books. And so then I would just give the sign painter the text and say, just make whatever you want. And so that's how it comes out. They all use their own styles, their own how big they wanted to make them, and just kind of have a collection of sign painters. And then, the subject of the books is there, and then some photographs of what I call dead signs, which is another kind of dead language.
Right.
And then in the case is a collection of books. If you kind of begin to piece them together, they can be a lecture. And that's why it's called, a lecture on, what is it? It's what was literature?
Good dreams, bad dreams.
Good dreams, bad dreams.
What was subliterature?
Yes. Right. And that's what it was called at the time, subliterature.
But this idea that you just mentioned of just telling the sign painters, go ahead and do what you want. Here's the text. Was very much about your work with Colby Poster Printing Company, and this is the facade of the building is now closed, but obviously a legendary contract printing company here in Los Angeles, since the 40s, right? I think when did they start?
Since the 40s, yeah.
But you were one of a lot of artists who were very interested in Colby or interested in the idea of taking their posters and doing something interesting with them. But you did, I think, probably the most with it. Graphic designers over the years have been really interested in Colby as an aesthetic, but they're very recognizable for those of you who don't know them, or you may recognize them now. These were posters meant to be viewed from the car. They were neon colored. The typography was arresting. It was straight ahead, and it was a way of instant communication. I think that a lot of artists were drawn to, but you used it in such effective ways, and used it for a lot of works. But the one that's in the exhibition is this one, which is another memorial. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about Ginsberg and how his particular form of language translated for you so well to Colby posters.
Well, it's a number of things. I mean, obviously, he was also somebody who was in my orbit, and would run into or meet or talk to once in a while and things, but also just influenced by who he was and the poetry, obviously. But this particular poem we all know is one of the most famous poems of the second half of the 20th century. But also, poetry is meant to be spoken, and the other thing that I liked about the obituaries or other things in the Times, New York Times particularly, is that they spell out words phonetically, or names phonetically. And so you find yourself, that's how you learn how to pronounce somebody's name. And so, I don't know, somehow in my brain it became, that would be a way to make people read Howl out loud, is by using phonetics. And because if you're looking at it, it makes you pronounce it. So I, used a number of different phonetical dictionaries, because there's different ways of doing phonetics. And then I would write the text out, and then I just took it down to Colby and gave it to them and said, here you are, because I didn't ever design these posters. I let them do it because I think they knew what they were doing.
Right.
Again, and so it took them about a year to do this because there's over 200 of them, and so they slowly worked on it while they did their other jobs, and then I mixed in the commercial jobs that they were working on at the same time. I just took them, they gave them to me, and then mixed the two languages together, the poetic language and the commercial language, everyday language. And so it's called, sculpture and book. And
but again, those parallel narratives, it feels like, there's that kind of real LA mixed with.
And it's at the time was
very beautiful Ginsberg
ubiquitous in LA. It's not anymore because the internet killed that.
Yeah.
So
I want to end just by thinking a bit about your persona again. We talked about it a little in Where's Al and in some of those early works where you've disappeared. But you're a narrator in a way in many of these works. And these are works that are peppered throughout the show. A few of them are from this series called Honey, I Rearranged the Collection, where you're kind of a narrator, where the background of every picture is the same. The first few words of the sentence are kind of the same, but then you change it up in each one. What you've called these kind of your New Yorker cartoons for the art world, but you're kind of in all of these in a way. They say a lot about where you've been as an artist, where other artists may have doubts and fears, and but they're also very funny and very incisive, I think, in terms of the art world itself. Here's my favorite. But can you speak a bit about where these came from?
Well, it's really a portrait of, if you've been around the art world long enough, you know all of these things, and you've heard them, or you somehow it's part of something and I've had people tell me that the museum curators, and say, oh yeah, I know where that came from. But it was something that I wrote, about 300 of them.
They're all in the catalog.
And then the image is an image of a library, and so it's like me rearranging my own collections of stuff with the knowledge that I have of the art world. Quite, a little bit ironic or sardonic or funny.
And I wanted to end with just a couple of pictures that, again, is this notion of you being present in your works, but somehow via a surrogate or a stand-in. And so this is actually not a portrait of you, but it's of your parents, early work in the show. But one of the first and only paintings you ever made. This one is a little more complicated. This is self-portrait as Herd Hatfield, as Dorian Gray. But they're made 10 years apart, these two?
They're made, maybe 10 years. I can't exactly remember, but they're made X number of years apart. And, if you know the story of Dorian Gray, and then you know the story of the actor who played Dorian Gray, who was forever identified as Dorian Gray in the London world. And so then the drawing of him, just to see how different it would be when I did the same drawing X number of years later, portraying this character from the picture of Dorian Gray and from the movie.
Yet it's a self-portrait.
And
As is self-portrait making a face like Barney Bear or self-portrait as Bugs Bunny. These are from the 70s. But this idea of hiding behind a character, do you want to talk about it a bit or not?
Well, even when I was using myself in the early photo pieces, and then I thought, well, I don't really want to have myself be so front and center here. So it's always, the artist is always hiding behind work. And it's just maybe a little more obvious here.
Or here.
Or here,
Yes,
right.
exactly. Maybe we'll end with that one. Thank you, Al, for sharing all of this with us.
Sure.
And I think Ara mentioned the exhibition is still on view upstairs, and we hope you have a chance to see it and enjoy it. Thank you so much.